We're carrying on our series. If you've not been along with us before, we've got a series called Up, and it's a little tweak on that theme just for this service. I was thinking to myself this week, the world's got some interesting patterns. The natural world has some interesting ways that it goes about things, doesn't it? An acorn falls to the ground, and it slowly shuffles underneath the dirt in such a way that unless you decide that's going to be your whole life to study that thing, you would just not even notice that it was happening. And then it gets hidden underneath the earth, lost basically to us. Yet all the while with this predetermined purpose that though it is lost to us for a while, it will grow into a huge big oak tree one day. And in reality, all the natural world around us, all the stuff that catches our eye, all the stuff that causes us to stop in wonder, the mountains, the hills, the valleys, all of this stuff, all the plants, all the trees, it all takes place in this almost incidental, accidental way where something falls from the ground, shuffles under the ground, and is buried, lost to us, and then grows into something that would stop us dead in our tracks. Watching the baptism today, I don't know how you get on, if it's the first baptism you've seen, if you've seen a few baptisms. I think and I was doing the baptizing, it's quite an odd thing to see somebody in full public view just put under the water. Bit threatening, a little bit odd, a little bit weird. And to add to the weirdness, Jess invited some of you good people here today to see that weird process, to see her get put under the water. It's quite an odd thing. Nobody else is doing this in Xscape, I don't think. Us in this room, I've drawn together to one side to say, right, we're going to stop over this moment where somebody is shuffled underneath the water. And we've all been invited to watch it, to stop and think about it, to consider the purpose of it. Our text today says, "Since then you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory." So I just want to, in the heat of the day, after the spectacle of the baptism, just draw out two simple points from that text. Firstly, what does it mean to be hidden? What was going on as Jess went under the water? What is that language in the text? That we are buried with Christ, that we are hidden with him. I want to think about that and to try my best to explain that. And I want us to think about what it means to fix our eyes on things above, to rise up out of the water. So firstly, really briefly, set your minds on things above. The text on the screen is part of a letter that Paul wrote to a church in Turkey, in Colossae. And if you read it, what you can see is that he's really looking out for some pretty new Christians who've got some fairly heavy-handed pressure on them to behave in a particular kind of way. Paul's writing into that circumstance. If you're a Christian, you should dress like this. If you're a Christian, you should eat. Believe it or not, the specifics were such. You should eat like this. You should go where we go. You should speak like we speak. It goes on to say, there's a backstory that also says, if you're a Christian, you should be having some ecstatic visions. And if you're not having any of this is the context that Paul's writing into, then you really need to listen to us, because we're having all of those things. And then, and I think this is what Paul is writing into, these people on this search to be Christ-like, on this search to find the way to be good. Instead of being good, or instead of it even being about God, it becomes a competition. It becomes competitive. It becomes about comparison, about what one person does over another. It becomes about superiority, who is better than somebody else. It becomes about proving yourselves better than somebody else. I think that's something that we can identify with when we try and think about how people go about finding a good way to live, or when people try and be good. Often, like we maybe see this in other people, I think it's one of those where you see it more easily in other people, but it's maybe true for us as well at the same time. It's a trap that we can fall into. And I think that kind of thinking informs how we interpret phrases like the one that Paul uses here, set your minds on things above. It's a really cool phrase, set your mind on things above. We've got similar phrases that we use in our language. Be the better person. That might be advice that you've given to some of your pals. It's really good advice. Be the better person. Rise above it. These are motifs that we throw about. They're really good ideas. At the core of them, they're really, really good ideas. But tell me if you've not fallen into the trap or observed the trap, that often underneath these really good ideas, as we try and fix our eyes on something better, we just end up in a competition. It ends up becoming about whether it's a competition that we can win if we've got a better way than somebody else, or if we can be better than somebody else, or it's about superiority. It's about just us being better than somebody else, a kind of superiority that we want to hold over other people. And what can happen to this lofty idea that our hearts and minds might go to a higher place? Focus your hearts and minds on things above. Actually, when you get into that mindset, what can often happen is that you're in a worse place. That you stay pretty much on ground level, if that's the way you go to find your way through life, or if that's the way you go to try and live a good life. Often, just because of the shape of life, we can stay pretty much on ground level. Our hearts and our minds don't get elevated as we try and live a good life. Sometimes they can get lowered. And that is not, I think this is the point. In verse 1, that is not what Paul is speaking about here. He's not saying, set your minds on things above. Try and get up there. Notice what it says in the text. Since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above. So the really critical bit is the first bit that I didn't emphasize on purpose because I wanted you to get the point. Since you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above. It's not that you need to see how to compete your way up, or prove your way up, or live your way up, or find your way up. It's not about climbing a ladder to get yourselves up to a point where you can see everything. What Paul's saying is, now that God has elevated you up to this point, how do things look from here? What can you see now? Since you've been raised with Christ, since he's lifted you up, since he's brought you up, since he's lifted you out of the gutter, now what can you see? Set your hearts on things above. If he's lifted you up, set your hearts on things above. I think often in life, especially in churchy life, in Christian life, we live a lot of our lives like we're trying just to achieve the view. We're trying to achieve the perspective. If we get a high enough position, or if we get a high enough salary, or if we get a high enough status, or whatever else it is, then we'll be able to see the way more clearly. We can clamber our way to the top. And once we clamber our way to the top, once we lift ourselves up, we'll be able to see enough to make sense of things. Paul says here really clearly, and the Bible, I guess, has a completely different slant on much of human thinking here. It says, God lifts us up, and he pulls us to his side. And from that point on, we orientate our life from the view that we get from there. Our thoughts aren't just formed by what's on ground level, but the view we get from heaven. Think about the oak tree, hopefully that you could see a little bit in that doodle that was on the screen, that was just at one point a seed in the ground. It didn't grow, the acorn didn't grow because it figured out, it had a good understanding of the mud, or it figured out how to scrape through the mud. The acorn grew because it realized it needed the sun, and it had to look up. Focus your eyes on things above. It's not climb up the ladder, it's see the perspective that knowing God gives you. To get underneath the skin of this idea, hopefully this illustration will be on point. I think everybody could relate to this one. Sometimes I'm conscious that some of my 90s music references are just, people just look straight through me when I talk about 90s music. This is not 90s music. Hopefully everybody can relate to this, so call me afterwards if you can't relate to this. Remember how we used to live pre-sat-nav? You remember how we used to live pre-sat-nav? Before, when we had to remember where to go? Do you remember those days when you used to have to get in the car and you used to have to think about that? When basically a trip anywhere, if you were going the other side of Bradford, basically this was pretty much the rule in our house. If you would go to the other side of Bradford, it would mean you would need like astronaut levels of concentration about the directions. You couldn't switch off for a second en route. What would happen in the cars I used to travel in, everybody would be involved in the journey. You wouldn't think about anything else. Everybody was engaged. And it felt like, I remember a few football games I went on the other side of Bradford, it felt like one false move and you'd had it. You could forget even trying to get to this football game. Now, when you go to the other side of Bradford, you can just slalom through weird industrial estates, council estates, places that you've never been, driving left, right, left again, and all the while you're listening to some deep and meaningful podcast about how to change your life. You can just be in another world, just drifting along, knowing fine well, watching the world go by, that you are going to arrive, and not only you are going to arrive, you're going to arrive at the exact point that sat-nav's telling you. It's never in question. And if you think you start to get lost, the sat-nav will say something like, well, you could go this way, or you could go that way, or you could go this extra way. There's hundreds of options because there's a satellite. I think this is how it works, sat-nav. I've made a bit of a jump at this point. Miles above us all, that sees all of the roads, and it sees all of the people, and it sees where all of the people are trying to get, and it is constantly calculating how on earth it can get all of these people to the places they want to go when they need to get there. Driving is not anymore. This is definitely, I got lost so many times. And it felt like it was just me and the next sign. It felt like it was just me and trying to remember that maze of information that my dad gave me before I set off. It is not like that anymore. We can locate ourselves. We can see the way home. Even when we're in the most obscure place ever, we can see the way home. We are oriented now from above. Paul tells us in this simple verse, or in these simple verses, we are still very much knocking about here. That's not his words, that's my words. But our hearts and our minds have been lifted somewhere else. If we've seen Jesus, we are still very much knocking about here. But if we have seen Jesus, then we have seen the compass points of heaven. If we have heard Jesus speak through his word, or however he would want to speak to us, then we have heard the directions of heaven. If we've seen him live, then we have seen something of the perspective of heaven. So we are no longer looking up in that sense to see where we need to go. We have been given a different view. What did Jesus say over and over again? And if you believe these words, then I think it's game-changing, faith-changing for how you see the world. He would say, I am the way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And it's not just that when we look at his way, we get to see a good way to go. I don't think that text is just saying that, although I think that that's true. it's saying part of us has been lost with him, has been given over to him. He's captured part of us. So we are still knocking about here, but part of the way that we think, part of the way that we love, part of the way that we feel about the creation, this world around us, has started to operate at a higher level. And he's saying, set your mind on things above, because you are risen with Christ. So we see differently. If you are a person of faith, here's my conviction: you occupy a lofty position. And I aren't saying that in an arrogant way, because what you see when you get the sat-nav view is that it was nothing to do with us. We are being made holy. That's quite a thing to say. But it was nothing to do with us. Jesus put us there, so it looks different. We get to occupy this incredible position and know at the same time full well it's nothing to do with us. So we walk into or towards, or we learn real humility. We get this lofty position, but we're really clear that it's not us. God has taken us that way. We can face times, and we will face times when we've got no idea where to turn. Do you know, like, as you think about your life, as you make your way down the road of life, you come to a fork in the road, you think, I've got no idea what to do here. But I guess if you've got faith, or I believe if you've got faith, you believe that God sees the whole route. He sees the whole way home, knows how long it's going to take, where you need to go, the whole thing. So it looks different. Trust that feels like it's incredibly important to have as life in life. It's something that you're driven towards. We might only see the next few steps. You know, in life, it's the truth, isn't it? We only really know what's coming in the next couple of hours that are ahead of us. Sometimes that's all that we can face. But if we know that there is a way mapped out, which is our conviction, that changes everything, doesn't it? It feels sometimes like we can be a bit lost. I can be guilty of living week to week. Probably need to work on that, but all at the same time, I know that God is in front of the next week, the next week, the next week, and the week after that, and that changes the way that you can just drift through life, or you can think about life, because if you believe that that's who God is, then there's always a purpose, there's always a route. We might feel really alone driving around in our cars on our own, on ground level. But God sees every single step, knows every single step. Being alone with God looks different. It looks loved. Jess, don't get weighed down by people's expectations of your faith. There will be many expectations that are put on you about what it means to have faith, mostly from religious people. Don't exhaust yourself trying to prove yourself. When you came up out of the water, it wasn't you. It wasn't even me and Boydie, although we had a hand in it, literally. It was God. That was God's part of your story. God lifted you up out of the water. You were raised with Christ, independent of us. It was faith that you had in something bigger. So don't get weighed down by expectation, but do hold on to the view that God has given. Last point. Hidden with Christ. What does it mean? Since then you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. It's not often, in fact, it's never the case that when a sentence starts with you died, we're expecting it to be a good sentence. Usually when sentences start with you died, we're either watching a dystopic Channel 4 show, or it's just really bad news. It's very rarely good news. Pretty much exclusively, sentences that start with you died are good news in the context of baptism, because you die not on your own, Through faith, you die with Christ. You own, believe, and trust his story, his place on the cross. And you see that story, that death, gruesome though it is, hard to watch though it is, distant though it is, and you say, that's for me. And because you say that, you hold the hope that comes with that came with Jesus through that of the resurrection. But then there's this tricky problem of the language. Hidden with Christ in God. What does that mean? What does it mean to be hidden with Christ in God? If you're doing that thing where you do the early morning Bible study and you just fly through something like that, you could easily just think, oh, I'll come back to that. That seems a bit tricky. My life is hidden with Christ in God. Does it mean that people just stop seeing me when I become a Christian? It can feel like that sometimes, actually. You do lots of the practices that you are taught, lots of the Christ-like things that we are taught, gentleness and forgiveness, on the few occasions that maybe we manage to pull it off and we're gentle in the workplace or we're forgiving in the workplace. It's not often seen. Might make you even less visible than you were. Is Christianity a kind of social obscurity where you just become incidental and disappear? What does it mean to be hidden? What is Paul talking about here? I think the idea of hiding now has got pretty negative connotations, hasn't it? Pretty much. When you think about the idea of hiding, it's like, what have you been up to that you're hiding something? That's where we go. Is it just me? Am I the only cynical one in here? When we think about the idea of hiding, it's like generally quite a negative thing. So it's in an odd place, been advocated in the Bible like this. But in the first century, it was much more celebrated. It was much more necessary, especially if you had stuff. You needed to know how to hide your stuff so it could be celebrated much more so. And the Bible would sort of back this up. David, the psalmist, talked about being hidden a lot. Hidden, and people were chasing him all the time, but when he talked about being hidden, he would say, in the day of trouble, God kept me safe. And these are his words. This is the Bible speaking to us. It says, hiding him in the shelter of his tabernacle. David would look at God and say, he's hidden me so that I am safe. It was a good thing. When Jesus spoke about the kingdom, he talked about it like it was a hidden treasure that was hidden in a field, and when someone found it, they would sell everything that they had, and they wouldn't get it out. They would sell everything that they had so they could hide it again and own the field. It was a good thing, this idea of being hidden. It's less about sinister motives, and it's more about needs, human needs, security. It's about being able to keep things that you treasure safe in a world that is unsafe. It comes from the word crypto, and you'll all be able to think of a couple of words perhaps that we get from this idea of cryptocurrency, that kind of thing, where we get the idea of a crypt from, where a body is secured in a vault. You're not going to get into a body that has been encrypted in that way, but it is left there for a time to be raised at a certain time. It's where we get the idea of encrypted. So we can send text messages to our loved ones, and we can have our bank details and remember a zillion passwords. Safely, we can keep all of our fortune somewhere in the cloud, however the heck that works, online, and know that it's safe. Know that it's still, unbelievably, even though it feels like it can't possibly be, know that it's still safe. We're very blessed at Christchurch to have ring-fenced Wi-Fi. I reference Craig at the back who sorted that out for us. Your information is safe with us here, as far as I know. We're ring-fenced. This idea that there is security, and then we've got security around our security, and then we've got even security around that security. Look at what Paul says in this verse. It's the idea of that. It's the idea of something being encrypted, something being triply secure. Paul puts it like this: you died, and your life is hidden in Christ. I've got 3 fingers, I should only have 2, but perhaps that's for the best. In God, triply encrypted. Your life is now hidden in Christ with God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, you will appear with him in glory. That deposit of your faith is safe. Paul is saying a precious part of who we are can be completely unseen, can disappear underfoot, as it were, and be unnoticed, and yet be completely secure to be seen at a later point. Paul is saying to us that the things that you can give over to God, things that you give up for this story, things that you sacrifice, things that you hold dear, prayers that you send up, forgiveness that you give out that's not noticed, humility that you show that comes from God but nobody else seems to see. All of these kind of things. God is not indifferent to them. He treasures them. He keeps them securely till the right time. Just to illustrate this, because I think this is really awesome. I think this is really awesome because we get hit by so much traffic in our lives. We try and live this life of faith, and I think often we wonder where it's all going. It feels like sometimes the faith that we have, the things that we do, can just dissipate into thin air because nobody sees them. God keeps what we commit to him. My granddad Marshall, granddad on my mum's side, he took ill with Alzheimer's when he was pretty young. He was a jigsaw enthusiast, very keen jigsaw enthusiast. He had a double wardrobe full of the jigsaws. And what would always happen, me and my brother went round to see him, he would say, come and see the jigsaws. Now, I think you can be excited about jigsaws maybe once. Not when it's every single time, and that's what Grandad Marshall would do. He'd take us and show us his jigsaws. It was a treasure trove for him. Even when the Alzheimer's really took over and he was really poorly, he would still show us the jigsaws and take real joy in showing us the jigsaws. Now, my granddad was the kind of bloke, he went to church occasionally, a couple of times as a kid, a couple of times a year. He sang hymns around the house, but he never really talked much about faith, so we didn't really know what was going on with that. But as it happened, before he got too ill, he left a note, and it was signed and dated, oddly enough, and it was describing his faith in Jesus. Really simple stuff, but it was like a proper official letter, signed, dated. Here's my story of faith. And what he did with that letter, as it happened, was chuck it in one of those jigsaw boxes. And that letter, inside those jigsaw boxes, inside that wardrobe, stayed unseen through the years he was well, through the years, good few years that he wasn't well, and for a good few years after we mourned his passing. But one day, Auntie Susan, as it was, found this note and showed us all this note. It was quite a moment when you realize that somebody was so literally gone, so literally absent, when you had mourned them so long, when so much time had passed, so much stuff had gone on, and he seemed so far from any kind of faith to know that that promise that he made, very simply, whenever it was held by God for all those years, enough to redeem him and redeem his life. To find, after all that, there was an incredible hope that he could be at perfect peace with his Savior. He hung on to, is my conviction, that note inside that box inside that wardrobe, inside that house. He kept it safe. Jess, everyone, the church will often miss the way that we live for God. People outside will often miss the way that we live for God. God won't miss it. God will treasure it. The little prayers that we send up, the acts of obedience that we do in complete obscurity, the love and gentleness that we're able to show even in moments, God treasures and he keeps and he shapes. And those who are buried with him, who go into the water with him, who are hidden with him, are those who even now are rising with him and seeing with him. So tomorrow, when your faith is hidden, when you're stuck in the mud, when you can only see things on ground level, don't scrape around in the dirt too much. Take time to look up at the sun.